Hi, everybody. I feel silly using the microphone in here, but that's all right. It's so people on Zoom can hear me. And if you're on Zoom, I just want to say if you have questions, you can always type them into the chat, and we'll get to them. My name is Kelsey Slater. I am an assistant professor in health, nutrition, and exercise science until the end of the day, when today's my last day. But still representing our department here at NDSU. I'm going to be talking about global learning from home and how we can incorporate collaborative online international learning, or COIL, into our kind of current study abroad model. So one of the reasons that COIL is really valuable is that it can help build things like intercultural competence, which is a really kind of important skill that our students, who we are trying to prepare for a really globalized society and a globalized workforce, really need. And intercultural competence is this ability to communicate effectively and appropriately in intercultural situations, and it's really based on intercultural knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Go ahead. Right, and this is definitely important because we're definitely trying to support the global economic landscape with intercultural skills. Right, students are no longer limited to where they're going to work, as well as they may be working, even if they're working here in the state of North Dakota, they may be working with international partners or partners from not just all over the world, but all over the country, working with people of diverse backgrounds. So having intercultural competence is really important. It's also really important for improved communication skills, as well as the kind of encouraging this application of knowledge transfer. And it can really promote, complement, or support other kinds of intercultural activities. So when you're doing this, a lot of people point to traditional study abroad models as a way to build intercultural competence, right? The idea that if you travel outside of the United States, you're going to learn about another culture just by the sheer nature of visiting another country. Oh, sorry. And sorry, I'm not used to standing in one place. I don't really like that. And you can get new experience and perspectives, better understanding of cultural differences, and even your own culture. So this past summer, summer 2024, I did take students to South Africa. And students, one of the big takeaways that they kind of shared with me is that they felt like they had a much better understanding of the world, but also of themselves and where they fit within the global community. So that can be really important. And you get kind of improved empathy, greater appreciation, respect for host communities. It also increases your ability to adapt, right? So if you're, traveling and you're then, maybe working in other languages, right? Or something like in South Africa where all of a sudden they drive on this other side of the road and you have to look one way or you're going to get hit by a car. You really need to, adapt and think on your feet. Something that I'm still not used to, and I've been there multiple times now. And I think it's also important that we do really intentional programming with intercultural competencies in mind, right? Growth in intercultural competence, it doesn't just happen because of travel, right? I think people have this preconceived notion that I'm going to go outside of the country and all of a sudden I'm going to become interculturally competent. But we have to match activities and coursework to these abroad activities for it to be effective. You can go ahead. And I just want to kind of give a brief overview of where we're at currently in study abroad before I talk about what COIL is and how we should be incorporating it. But in the most recent data, 2023, 2024, a total of 249 students from NDSU studied abroad. If you are thinking to yourself that that's abysmally low, it is for a major R1 institution, right? Most students are going on short-term faculty-led programs, 89 during spring break, 66 during summer term, including my students who did study abroad during summer term. Then 16% were going on semester or year programs, 6% were doing internships, 2% were doing volunteer programs, and then that little red bar is summer only. Okay. I don't know why it doesn't have a label there. And where do we stack up in North Dakota? So this is actually from 2022, 2023, but I'm just kind of giving you the landscape of where North Dakota is in study abroad. And we are, as you can see from this diagram, NDSU is leading the way in study abroad in the state. But we are 50 of 50 in the US for study abroad. For students who study abroad in the United States, we are the lowest. Yes, we have the lowest amount of like we have a low population, of course, but when we're talking about percentages, we're abysmally low. We're hanging out around the bottom. And if you're thinking like, oh, is this because of the pandemic? Nope, we were hanging around 49, 50 pre-pandemic, and that's still where we are. Go ahead, next slide. When we look at this diagram, almost 300,000 students from the United States studied abroad in this year. So we're a very, very, very small portion of that. Go ahead, next slide. And of course, you can see like, oh, maybe it's the pandemic, but you can see we had a huge kind of at the peak there in that was 2018, 2019 open door year. Almost 350,000 students were studying abroad in a given year. Huge drop off, of course, in 2020 and 2021 because one, programs were canceled, couldn't do it. People were being called home. People weren't going. Right, there was restrictions, couldn't leave the country. But it's really kind of bounced back. And it's definitely taken some time. But I think we're going to continue to see this kind of upward trajectory. I don't know if we'll ever return to pre-pandemic levels, but I think we're moving in the right direction in terms of study abroad. Go to the next slide. But there are, of course, barriers to study abroad that I think are really important that we need to talk about. And that's why I think virtual exchange and COIL can be so important because they can kind of challenge some of these barriers. But one of the main barriers is this idea of unequal access. And there's costs, right? Short-term provider-led programs have completely ballooned. And what we found is that Pell-eligible students in particular are much less likely to study abroad than their non-Pell eligible counterparts. And of course, there are great Pell programs like the Gilman Scholarship, which can provide up to $5,000 for Pell eligible students to use on a study abroad program. One of my students who studied abroad, he did win a Gilman Scholarship and it covered about $3,000 worth of his travel, which was the difference in whether he was going to attend or not. Right, so costs for short-term programs have really skyrocketed. And it doesn't help that students want to travel to places that are going to be more expensive. Right, if you're traveling to Western Europe, you want to go to the UK, you want to go to Italy, costs are going to be much more expensive than if you're going somewhere in Latin America or even parts of Asia. There's also this barrier. Oh, sorry, I'm not done. Time to degree completion. Students with complex degree plans and prereqs, particularly in STEM fields, are going to be limited in study abroad because they can't just go away for a semester and then come back and jump right back into their program because classes that they took in the fall are their prereqs for the spring. Right. So if you're, for example, like if you're in a nursing program, you can't just miss your nursing 300 and then jump right back in nursing 301 in the spring. You have to reset. So it's definitely challenging for our students, particularly in STEM fields, and they're much less likely to study abroad. And then there's this other piece that I think is quite fascinating is this idea of fear as a barrier, fear associated with unfamiliar places, language barriers, and discrimination. Being from the Northeast, many of my friends studied abroad, and they didn't necessarily. I wasn't really familiar with this until I actually moved to Mississippi, where when I would talk to my undergraduate students about studying abroad, they'd say, "That's not for me. I don't want to leave the United States," or like, "I'm not comfortable leaving the U.S." So I thought that was really, really interesting. And I think this could have some regional specific aspects as well. And scholars brighter than me have studied that extensively. Okay, now you can move on. So one way that I want to kind of combat these barriers, or a way that I think we can combat these barriers, is actually through this idea of virtual exchange. And virtual exchange is a method that's going to use technology to connect people for education and exchange. And go to the next slide. And one, I think, really great way that we can do this is through collaborative online international learning, or COIL. Some people use this term interchangeably with virtual exchange, but These are going to be programs that are fostering faculty and student interaction with peers abroad through co-taught, multicultural, online, and blended learning environments that are emphasizing experiential student collaboration and engagement. Right, so this is going to be in a co-taught um, format. Right, virtual exchange doesn't necessarily have to be co-taught. It can be one class that might be hosted at one institution and then has people taking it from all over the world. Right, but the COIL method, it's two unique classes being taught in two places that are taught kind of together. And I'll show you what those models kind of look like here in the next couple slides. Right, so I think we really need to think about incorporating COIL at NDSU. As we just learned, study abroad in this state is low. And the study abroad office here, the international students office, they're doing some amazing work to try to increase those numbers, but those barriers are still very real. And I think having COIL is a good way to increase access to international learning from our students from different backgrounds. It can make a really positive academic, social, and cultural outcomes for participating students. And it can also help in build and sustain partnerships around the world. Right? We have a lot of really great existing partnerships, and COIL can be a way that we can also connect our students. Right? So if you think about, a lot of faculty have existing partners with people from all over, scholars from all over. This can be a way that our students can then access some of those really great partnerships. And I think it's a good way, again, to strengthen these kinds of connections. And it's part of our strategic plan, is getting our students ready for this globalized workforce. And I think COIL can be a really good way to do that. Virtual exchange is definitely going to be a high impact practice. So when we're talking about why this matters and why this is also going to help things like retention and engagement, is that high impact practices in global learning are definitely linked to an improved retention rate as well as an increase in overall student success. Right? We know that high impact practices work. Right? We know that study abroad is a high impact practice. Right? However, we realize that there are significant barriers to students going abroad, and COIL is one way that we can kind of circumvent those. All right, we can go to the next slide. So what does it look like? All right, so if we were to try to set up a COIL, right, there's really no right way to do it. Right, so a COIL or a virtual exchange program, they can be synchronous, they can be asynchronous, they can be both, right? So if you look here at this little pie chart in terms of how COIL programs operate, most are going to be a mix, right? So if you see this primarily synchronous and primarily asynchronous, those make up the two biggest pieces of the pie, right? So it's definitely going to be a combination. There's also still a really large chunk of synchronous only as well, and then a much smaller chunk of asynchronous only as well, right? So a much smaller piece is going to be asynchronous only. But an example of something that might be both, you might have synchronous dialogue and maybe breakout sessions in a Zoom one week, and then asynchronous work on a project the next week. Okay, so that would be an example of both. All right, go ahead. All right, as to my knowledge, we don't do this here. To my knowledge, I don't know of anyone who's currently operating COIL. I have asked a good number of faculty if they're doing it. There probably are some. I just don't know them, and they haven't responded when I asked the question. But even with our, the university's kind of emphasis on promoting online learning, I don't see that translating to international education here, right? Whereas online learning is the future. Our students are in online classes. They're, in some cases, earning complete degrees in online environments. Why can't we replicate this model and emphasize international education as well? Go ahead. Right? We have the infrastructure to do it. I think that's also a really big piece. People are like, oh, maybe it's really expensive. We're already paying for Zoom. Most universities are, right? This room is equipped with the ability to create these kinds of synchronous environments, right? We have these technologies, learning management systems, Microsoft Teams, Zoom. We also have really diverse course offerings, right? So in a place like NDSU, as well as many places across the country, for those of you who are joining us from outside the NDSU community, right? Classes also don't need to be in the same field in order to collaborate, which I think is another really important piece. And I'm going to show kind of two examples of how a COIL could work using one that is classes are the same, where classes are completely different. So there are, again, still some challenges. The digital divide, there is unequal access across the globe to the internet. All right. For example, when I work with people in South Africa, they have these kinds of rolling blackouts there to conserve energy. And I always have to, whenever I'm collaborating with someone, they always have to, like shoot me a WhatsApp message that says like, we're actually load shedding right now, so I I can't get online. Let's try tomorrow. All right. So you have to be flexible. Not everyone's going to have this same access. Time zones. I mean, I'm used to getting up early to talking to my colleagues in Europe or South Africa, but I know my students probably aren't. So thinking about time zones is pretty crucial. Language barriers. Again, language barriers are going to be a unique challenge that we have to think about. Right. Sometimes that's the point. You know, a lot of COIL got started as language partnerships, right? You have students who are based maybe in Morocco who are working on their English, and you have students in the US who are working on their Arabic, and they kind of work together to really collaborate to have kind of shared learning goals in terms of language development, but the language development are in two different languages. And then cultural differences, understanding how students work, how classes work, how classes are structured. Those are going to be unique cultural differences that you also have to consider when you're building a COIL. Go ahead to the next slide. So a COIL in sport management that had I not been leaving this institution is something that I was going to actively work on for the next academic year. The class at NDSU that I teach, Global Perspectives in Sport. It's a 400 level class. It's a class that all of my students have to take. We offer it in the spring, which is the South African fall. And then Etta College, which is a institution that is sport management and exercise science focused in South Africa, where I have partners, and my students actually visited there when we went to South Africa last summer. They have a class in their fall, which is our spring, on event management, event safety, and sport tourism. A big piece of our 414 class here in North Dakota is talking about global sporting events and their impact on society. So one of our kind of plan was to do both synchronous and asynchronous activities. Yes, that would require my students being up a little bit earlier than normal, but they can handle it. And having dialogue discussions, right? So using Zoom to facilitate breakout rooms where we have, prompts, and then we bring the students back together to kind of present and discuss each of breakout rooms prompt related to, for example, like global sport event development, right? So maybe one group would be talking about like what a media plan might look like for a global sporting event, where another one might be talking about how a city might kind of put together a bid related to their infrastructure, right? So many little breakout sessions like that, where then they would come back and present to the group. And then also have a project-based kind of mega event proposal, both in African and North American context. So they would work in mixed groups and work on the same kind of assignment, where they would actually propose hosting either a mega event, probably not the Olympic Games because that's ambitious, but a world championship or a regional event of some kind, or even like a national championship in either an African or a North American context. So some students in the South African context would actually be working on a proposal for a North American city, whereas some students from the US would actually be working on a African context, right? But it's a shared assignment, right? So this would be a COIL in the idea that our classes are actually operating separately, but there's one assignment, well, two, because the discussions would also be kind of assignments in their own way. There'd be two shared assignments, right, that are meeting one learning outcome that is shared between the two classes. Okay, so in this case, the learning outcomes match and the assignment is completely shared, right? So this is when what a coil might look like for a program that's got the same learning outcomes and goals, right, for an assignment, right? Because we each have learning outcomes about event management proposals in global settings. All right, go to the next slide. All right, so again, this is kind of what the proposed activities, which I just discussed, all kind of look like, where they suggest hosting these kinds of world championships. And they would present together via Zoom, right, to the whole kind of class. Um, and this is an assignment that I actually do with my students now. It's just got a global focus as opposed to a very specific North American and Africa focus. So it's already kind of an assignment that I had existing, and they actually had a similar assignment, and we kind of adapted it to fit both classes' needs, right? So one of the big challenges here is making sure that there's programmatic fit, right, and assignment fit. If those didn't line up, it would be tough to uh, make it work for these two classes, right? Or we'd have to create kind of a new assignment that might fit both learning outcomes of the courses. So having that kind of symbiotic relationship where you're looking at sets of learning outcomes, what you want your students to learn, and if you can make those match up, you can have coil can be really effective. So that's a great question, right? So typically, just because I know them, they typically have 20 students a class. Granted, I had almost 40 this coming semester. So if that is the case, we would have to make some kind of collaborative decision on, so maybe only 20 of my students who are actually able to participate in coil, right? So because I might have some student athletes who might not be available and able to participate, and we have to make some adaptations in order to make it work. But if there are those large numbers, so if they're in groups of 4, right, so it might be in some cases that 1 student from South Africa and 3 of my students. So you just have to make adaptations that are going to be that work for you. If they're really that different, some people say like we can't make that work. Like I know people that run coils and they say that they have to hit a minimum number in each class for it to be effective. And so some of them say like, all right, like I'm capping my US class at 20. If they don't get 15, we're not doing it, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think it's good to try to adapt as opposed to canceling it altogether. But those are something you really do have to think about too, is at what point does an assignment no longer work, right? But I think adapting to those challenges is more effective. Really good question. All right. An example in interdisciplinary learning. So I'm taking a class at NDSU that I'm on the gen ed committee. So this is going to be a new class that's going to be offered this coming year. And it's Spanish 103, beginner Spanish for healthcare, which I think is a really good idea, which is why I chose it for this example. And then there's a class, which again, I'm going to show you how I found this class in a second here, at Universidad de Sonora, which is in Mexico. And it's on health promotion. And their target audience is nursing students. I was told by Heath over in Spanish that the target audience for Spanish 103 is nursing students. So these are 2 completely different classes, completely different learning outcomes, but something they have in common is the population, right? So that to me kind of signaled, okay, maybe there's an opportunity for a coil here. So they could have some synchronous and asynchronous activities, right? So maybe there's some language learning and practice on health topics, right? Where they're having collaborative discussions in Spanish and English about health in their communities or their kind of experience in healthcare in their two areas. Right? And then maybe they could do some kind of collaborative project on comparative health promotion. So, for example, like the students in Spanish 103 could talk about how they might implement a health promotion program here in Fargo, right? Where they're also like kind of maybe using their language skills. So if they were working with a population whose first language is Spanish, what they might do to try to incorporate this health promotion project. And then the same thing at the Universidad de Sonora. They would also create a health promotion project, and then they would share out, right? And they would be able to ask questions and kind of try to learn from each other, as well as the beginner Spanish for healthcare, Spanish 103. They could try to absorb their presentations in Spanish and see what they could understand, right? So, from a practical perspective, it's incorporating additional vocabulary that they may not be familiar with. So, that would be a kind of an example of interdisciplinary learning, right? So, they're practicing their language skills again, and then they have this kind of asynchronous research project, and they're examining these health promotion activities in their local communities. You can go to the next slide. So, where did I find this Mexican university? I am not an expert in nursing in the Mexican context by any means, but what is great is that we have a great platform that is available to us called Coil Connect. It is a platform where if you are interested in developing a coil and you have a class or topic that you're interested in exploring, you can put your class in and say, all right, I am teaching intro to economics this year, and I'm looking for a partner. Maybe this partner is also teaching intro to economics, or maybe they are teaching something outside of that economics box, right? Or maybe they're something in like economics adjacent, some kind of development course, right? And you have your partners, right? So you have the country over here. This country is Switzerland, for example. It's going to have the language that they expect. So Switzerland's great because you can see sometimes they have English, sometimes they have French, sometimes they have German. When they're planning on starting it, and if they've got a partner or not, right? So some of these classes they've already got somebody partnered and they're actively building a coil. Some of them are still seeking partners, right? So if you're interested in data science basics, the Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts is actively looking. So this could be really beneficial to see if there's anyone out there who might have a similar kind of coil strategy or might be interested in building a coil with you. And I'm not gonna say that it's not more work, but when we're trying to engage students in high impact practices, it's always gonna be more work. But coil can be a really great way that students can gain some of these skills from home. Right? It's global learning without them having to actually leave Fargo, which is can be quite a beneficial idea. So Coil Connect is a really great opportunity. I mean, I get an email from them every day about new courses that are seeking partnerships. And while sometimes having a partner that you have in mind already, like I did with at a college, can be great. But if you're thinking to yourself, I don't really know where to start, Coil Connect is a really great place. There's also tons of really great resources, which I've cited a ton in this presentation from the Stevens Initiative. They are pretty much one of the experts on building virtual exchange. I did a great professional development course with them last fall that pretty much gave me all of the tools I needed to build a virtual exchange program. All right, so to sum up, virtual exchange coil, it's a really great opportunity for students to have access to international education without having to actually leave their front door. We can do things like language development, working with people from diverse backgrounds, forging these kinds of connections around the world can have lasting benefits for students. Right? So if we're trying to help students engage and be better public speakers, better communicators, this can be a really great way that we can give them access to these kinds of resources. there are barriers, right? Just like with anything, typically you might have more work on the faculty side. Um, you're going to have to worry about time zones. Yeah, having partnerships in Mexico is great. They're kind of in the same time zone as us in a lot of ways, or maybe an hour in either direction, depending on where they are. And if we care about developing a global workforce with culturally relevant skills, we have to be able to kind of support faculty, staff, and students so that we can create these kinds of projects that are going to have long lasting benefits. We have to do something to give our students tools to make a difference. And COIL is a really great way to do that. So if there's questions, I'm happy to talk more about this. But if there's questions online too, you can always find me, and there's a bunch of resources, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So one of the things, and I didn't kind of talk about this, is that even before you start the actual COIL activities, you're going to have more like breakout social sessions, right? Where it's maybe not just about engaging in sport topics, but it's having icebreakers and other activities like that, where students can kind of learn about each other. Because so you think about maybe in a semester long project, we're not actually going to be participating in the assignment maybe for the first 6 weeks, but you can have kind of more informal discussions, right, where they might be able to meet doing one-on-ones even, right? So if they know what group they're in, they might be able to have informal conversations. And how you set it up is going to be unique to you and unique to your classroom setting. But I think having some of those like informal aspects, and it could be a graded assignment, right? It's like, did you check in with one of your partner people today, right? And you could have those kinds of aspects really built into the COIL, so they're getting to know them before they even work on before they work on the assignment. So there's going to be that piece at the front that you're going to work on. And maybe it's bringing the entire group together. Maybe it's then having individual sessions, but that's in the front, and then you work on the assignment. If that makes sense. So I've been in some actually I've been in some programs, even in the Stevens Initiative, for example, has people from the US as well as from North Africa and the Middle East. And when English isn't necessarily their first language, that does come across. What's great is that there are so many why can't I use the word translation tools that are also built into a lot of your platforms now that you can use. So we always do that. We always make sure that we have captions in both languages available. And some of it is also, I think it's again on the facilitators to instruct people to be ready to speak slowly, right? Or maybe you have to repeat yourself. Maybe it's something as simple as, okay, also type your idea in the chat. Because some people, they may not feel as comfortable speaking English, but they're better at reading it, right? Or vice versa. If you have like very beginner Spanish skills, you're comfortable reading it, but maybe you're not as comfortable speaking. So having those kinds of captions or being able to type in the chat. Also, when you have instructors who have familiarity in both languages, that can also be really beneficial. And that's another like good way, I think, to incorporate it. And sometimes people do have full translators available in their COILs. It really depends on what their resource availability is. And if you know that the language barrier is going to be a big challenge for you, start with a COIL where you are the two parties have a shared language, and go from there. I think that's what a lot of people do, is they say like, okay, I really want to run this. I have language concerns. I'm not going to partner with a French speaking country if my French is not strong enough. All right, so it's also about knowing your own capabilities too. I didn't ask for permission. I was just planned on doing it because it's in my classroom. But I think for us, when you're talking about like your teaching load, this would still count as one class for me, even if I'm also working with people outside of my classroom. But that's really at my own discretion. Do I think that we need to be um, providing additional credit to people participating in high impact practices and even things like research? Yes, but that's why the workload agreements are under such high scrutiny right now. Um, and I think it's about having discussions with your stakeholders. Um, I think because of the benefits, people aren't going to give pushback in that sense as long as you feel confident about being able to do it. Um, but always, and that's something that working with study abroad office at your location is also very important, and how you might offer the class as well is going to also impact. Also, if you're offering a class that's fully online anyway, that may also be like a good way to um, reduce some of your load, right? So if you're operating a coil and you're operating an in-person section of the same class and it's only counting as one, that's more problematic. But if you're operating a class online anyway and you're incorporating a coil, that may limit some of those faculty barriers. So I would actually encourage to test this on fully online classes first. Like unless you're really confident with the format, you're really comfortable with your partner organization. That I can't stress that enough. If you're not comfortable with your partner organization, you have to have a really strong relationship. That's really, I think that building that relationship is really important. But I would say trying it with fully online classes first is a good first step.